Okay, chapter 5, greatest miracle in the world. The God memorandum was not discussed again during the entire summer and fall while our friendship gradually ripened into a bond of love. Stopping off at Simon's place nearly every evening and soon during the lunch hour, too, were the highlights of my week. Simon's frugal quarters became my oasis of peace and equanimity during each working day, and the weekend seemed tortuously endless away from him. Yet, for reasons I still do not understand, I never discussed him, never even mentioned him to my family or anyone at Success Unlimited. Simon became my adopted father, my teacher, my business consultant, my comrade, my rabbi, my priest, my minister, my guru, my Delphic oracle. I canceled business invitations and skipped social functions to spend my time with him, and I literally began to sit at his feet to listen to him lecture to his classroom of one, me, on any subject. Displaying an amazing range of knowledge and experience, he would expound for all too seemingly brief periods on love, politics, religion, literature, psychiatry, nature, and even more exotic matters such as extrasensory perception, astrology, and even exorcism. Occasionally, I would prod him on with a question or statement that was calculated to keep him talking, or I might introduce a new subject on which I wanted his opinion. The depth of his knowledge, especially in philosophy and the behavior of man, never ceased to amaze me. Once he interrupted himself while deep in a violent condemnation of the attitude of complacency, lack of pride, and standard of mediocrity that he was convinced had become our world's way of life, to ask me if I realized that by listening to him, I was taking a pre rag picker course, just as others took pre med or pre law. Then he hastened to show his approval of my presence by reminding me that those who eventually became the best rag pickers were individuals like myself who had done time on junk heaps and walked away from their own cemetery for the living. For 5 months, I attended the finest university in the country. Professor Simon Potter taught. I listened and learned, and he skillfully introduced his favorite people to me, both living and dead, through fascinating, little known anecdotes and quotes to help him dramatize his most pressing theme, that we all had more than enough ability to change our lives for the better, and that God had never placed any of us in a hole from which we could not grow. And if we had locked ourselves in a prison of failure and self pity, we were the only jailers. We had the only key to our freedom. He spoke of our fear to take chances, to venture into unfamiliar enterprises and territories, and how even those few who risked their future in order to advance still found it necessary to constantly fight that compelling urge to flee back into their previous familiar womb of security, no matter how bleak their old existence had been. Simon pointed out that Abraham Maslow, one of America's greatest psychologists, had called this the Jonah complex, the innate desire to hide from the possibility of failure. He was a great believer in making decisions and then burning your bridges behind you so that you had to make good. And he told how Alexander the Great once handled such a situation. It seems that the great general was about to lead his army against a powerful foe whose men greatly outnumbered his own. Because of the odds against them, his army had shown little enthusiasm for the upcoming battle as they set sail for what they feared would be their end. When Alexander finally unloaded his men and equipment on enemy shores, he issued an order for all his ships to be burned. As their means of retreat slowly sank in flames behind them, Alexander rose to address his men and said, "See your crafts going up in smoke? their ashes floating on the sea. That is our assurance that we shall be victorious, for none of us can leave that despicable land unless we are victorious in battle. Men, when we go home, we are going home in their ships. Simon did not believe that one should continue to work at a job which made him or her unhappy or miserable. He quoted Faulkner to reinforce his argument, trying to imitate the great writer's southern drawl. One of the saddest things in life is that the only thing we can do for 8 hours a day after day, is work. We can't eat for 8 hours a day, nor drink for 8 hours a day, nor make love for 8 hours a day. All we can do for 8 hours is work, which is the reason why man makes himself and everybody else so miserable and unhappy. Then, to summarize that particular lecture, he would once again state his point that a job that made one unhappy should be abandoned. It is not true, Mr. Ogg, that a rolling stone gathers no moss. A rolling stone can gather moss and a good deal more. He presented Mark Twain to illustrate his belief that experience was usually an overrated quality. I could almost picture old Samuel L. Clemens in his wrinkled white suit saying, "We should be careful to get out of an experience all the wisdom that is in it, not like the cat that sits down on the hot stove lid. She will never sit down on a hot stove lid again. And that as well, but also she will never sit down on a cold one anymore." He had little sympathy for those who blamed their plight or poor fortune on a handicap, either physical or environmental. He reminded me of Milton's blindness, Beethoven's deafness, Roosevelt's polio, Lincoln's poverty, Tchaikovsky's tragic marriage, Isaac Hayes' frightening early years of poverty, Helen Keller's lack of hearing and sight, and even Archie Moore's climb out of the ghetto. He relived for me John Bunyan writing Pilgrim's Progress while in prison, Charles Dickens pasting labels on blacking pots, Robert Burns and Ulysses S. Grant fighting the hell of alcoholism, and Benjamin Franklin dropping out of school when he was only 10. Then I was afloat with Eddie Rickenbacker, who was asked after he was rescued what the biggest lesson was that he had learned while drifting about with his buddies in life rafts for 21 days when lost in the Pacific during World War II. Rickenbacker had replied, "The biggest lesson I learned was that if you have all the fresh water you want to drink and all the food you want to eat, you ought never to complain about anything." Simon's point was that no person ever had a defect that was not really a potential benefit rather than an adversity. And once he told me a short fable. It seemed like that a handsome stag admired his horns and hated his ugly feet. But one day a hunter came, and the stag's ugly feet enabled him to flee to safety. Later, his beautiful horns became caught in the thicket, and before he could escape, he was shot. Simon would stare at me and say, "Mr. Ogg, when you begin feeling sorry for yourself, remember the tiny couplet. I had the blues because I had no shoes, until upon the street I met a man who had no feet." He was always defining abstract words with colorful analogies. Once, when I asked him to describe love, he said, "A few years ago at your Indianapolis race, a fine driver named Al Unser skidded and hit the wall. He lay slumped in his burning car for only a few seconds before another racing vehicle skidded and stopped alongside his wrecked automobile. Then, while the other cars roared past, some coming dangerously close to the second car, out clambered a young man named Gary Bettenhausen, who rushed over to Unser's car and began pulling him from the flames. Mr. Bettenhausen had completely put out of his mind that he was in a race for which he had expended a fortune and months of preparation. That act to Simon was what love was all about. Simon had another favorite in the auto racing world, Sterling Moss. After quoting Thoreau's axiom that men were born to succeed, not fail, the old man would beautifully mimic Moss's precise British accent to make the point that man could accomplish any goal if he were willing to pay the price. He would repeat Moss's famous quote, I was taught that everything is attainable if you're prepared to give up, to sacrifice, to get it. Whatever you want to do, you can do it. If you want to do it badly enough. And I do believe that. I believe that if I wanted to run a mile in 4 minutes, I could do it. I would have to give up everything else in life, but I could run a mile in 4 minutes. I believe that if a man wanted to walk on water and was prepared to give up everything else in life, he could do that. And of course, Simon was always saying that most humans quit too soon in life. Mr. Ogg in Sonoma, California, there was a marvelous driving school for aspiring race drivers or anyone who really wants to learn the fine art of driving. It is called the Bob Bondurant School, I believe. Their instructors say that most drivers on our nation's road abandon their car too soon when they see an accident coming. As the collision looms, they stop trying to save either the automobile or themselves by proper steering and braking, when a good deal could have been done up to the moment of impact to lessen the seriousness of the crash. They give up and they pay for it. So do humans, most humans, in most of their daily activities. Then he would rise, scowl at me, extend two fingers upward in a V, and deliver what he said Winston Churchill had claimed was the greatest secret of success ever formulated. And it only was 6 words long. Never, 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 never give up. While his discussions often wandered far afield, they always eventually returned to his concern about the growing lack of self-esteem in man and its usual end product, a living death. What frustrated him most were the living deaths that finally became actual suicides, lives he had been unable to save because, as he put it, he just couldn't be everywhere, and there never seemed to be enough rag pickers to go around. Mr. Ogg, look at your watch, fix the time in your mind, and then remember this. By this same hour tomorrow night, more than 950 individuals will try to kill themselves in this country. Think of that. And do you know what? More than 100 will succeed. He would pound the arm of his chair and continue, that is not all. We will add 40 new heroin addicts in the next 24 hours. 37 will die of alcoholism, and nearly 4,000 unfortunate individuals will have their first mental collapse by this time tomorrow. Then think of the other ways that we show how little we appreciate the amazing creatures that we are. In the next 24 hours, nearly 6,000 sick and confused individuals will be arrested for being drunk and disorderly, and more than 150 will show how little they value their precious lives by driving too fast, causing their own deaths or deaths of others. Mr. Ogg, do you know why this condition exists and is growing in tempo here and throughout the world? I would merely shake my head and wait, because all of us know that we can be better than we are. Oh, it is true that most humans cannot translate this hidden feeling into words, but there has been something implanted within each human being that removes him or her completely from the animal kingdom. And that something, almost a second conscious, continues to remind us at the most unexpected moments of our dull lives that we are not living up to our potential. It is only logical, therefore, that if we know we can do better and we are not doing better, if we know we can be earning more worldly goods and we are not, If we know we can handle a more difficult and better paying job and we are not, then we do not think very much of this failure who walks around with our name. Gradually, we grow to hate that person. Do you know of Maslow, Mr. Og? I've never been able to understand too much that he wrote, Simon. Maslow is not difficult if you read slowly and think. Two out of style activities in this country. I know. Maslow once wrote that either people do things which are fine and good and thus respect themselves, or they do contemptible things and feel despicable, worthless, and unlovable. To my way of thinking, Maslow did not go far enough. I believe that most humans feel despicable, worthless, and unlovable without doing contemptible things. Just being sloppy in their work or not caring about their appearance or not studying or working a little longer to improve their position in life or taking that unnecessary drink or doing 1,000 other stupid small acts that tarnish their already bruised self image is enough to increase their self hatred. Most of us not only have a will to die, we also have a will to fail. Sometimes Simon would even quote one writer quoting another writer. We are all unhappy, Mr. Odd. Henry Miller was always haunted by Tolstoy's sentence: if you are unhappy and you know that you are unhappy, but Simon, most of us are unhappy only because we have problems. I can take you right now to a hospital in this city where they have ward after ward of tremendously happy people. They're laughing all the time. They no longer face their problems, and there are bars on their windows. I am not suggesting an impossible euphoric state of permanent happiness as a lifetime shield from our problems. That is impossible. Problems, big and small, will be every one of us so long as we live. Norman Vincent Peale once said that the only time he found people with no problems was when he walked through a cemetery. No happiness is not a cure all, it is an antidote, something that will enable us to handle and deal with our problems and still maintain our self esteem so that we do not resign from the human race. And the ultimate form of resignation, of course, is suicide. Why in the hell do we do such a poor job of dealing with our problems, Simon? Why are we all so unhappy when the ingredients for happiness are all around us? Is that another curse, like original sin or worse? Why are we unhappy? I will repeat it for you. We are unhappy because we no longer have our self esteem. We are unhappy because we no longer believe we are a special miracle, a special creation of God. We have become cattle, numbers, punch cards, slaves, ghetto residents, all. We look in our mirrors and no longer see the godlike qualities that once were so evident. We have lost faith in ourselves. We have really evolved into the naked apes that Desmond Morris wrote about. When did all this happen? I don't know for a certainty, but of course I have a hypothesis. I believe it may have begun with Copernicus. Copernicus, the Polish astronomer? Yes, actually, he was a medical man. Astronomy was only a hobby with him. Still, before Copernicus, man actually believed that he lived in the absolute center of God's universe here on earth, and that all those tiny lights above merely hung there for his pleasure, entertainment, and illumination. Then Copernicus proved that our planet was not the center of anything and that we were just another tiny ball of dirt and stone moving around in space and held captive by an immense globe of fire many times our size. This was a tremendous jolt to our ego. We refused to accept the brilliant man's discovery for centuries. To pay that price to acknowledge that we were less than God's special children was too terrible to contemplate, so we postponed payment. We refused to listen. And then, 400 years later, our self esteem was seriously wounded again. Great Britain produced a brilliant naturalist, Darwin, and he told us that we were not special creatures of God, but had our roots in an evolving animal kingdom. He even rubbed salt in our self esteem by telling us that we were descended from the animal kingdom. This was exceedingly distasteful pill for man to swallow. In many quarters, as you know, he still has not gulped it down. Still, it was a great boon to many, for here was science now recognizing and condoning mankind's bestial behavior. After all, if we were only animals, what could you expect from us? Thus, our self image, our self esteem, our self love slipped a few more rungs down the ladder to misery and hell. Darwin gave us our animal permits. After Darwin, what? After Darwin, Freud, and more broken windows in the house of self esteem. Freud told us that we were unable to control many of our actions and thoughts, nor could we even understand them, since they had originated from every early childhood experiences involving love and hate and repression, now buried deeply within our subconscious minds. That just what we needed. Now we had a license from one of the world's most brilliant medical authorities to do anything we wished to ourselves and to others. We no longer needed a rational explanation for our activities. Just act and blame the consequences on our father or our mother. Simon, let me be sure if I comprehend what you're saying. Your position is that man at one time, perhaps through a closer communion with his God, believed that he was truly a marvelous creation, a superior being made in the image of God. Then he began to make discoveries that gradually chipped away at the high opinion he had of himself until he eventually was thinking, if we're not godlike people, if we do not live in the center of God's world, if we are really only animals, and if we cannot control and explain many of our actions, then we are not of any more consequence than the weeds in our garden. If we are not, in truth, very much of anything, then how can we be proud of ourselves? And if we are not proud of what we are, how can we like ourselves? And if we don't like ourselves, who wants to live with that sort of person? So let's get rid of ourselves. Let's drive too fast or drink too much or eat too much or purposely foul up so that we can get ourselves fired from our jobs, so that we can sit in the corner and suck our thumbs and tell ourselves that we're worthless anyway. So what the hell? Is that it? Exactly. Now it was my turn. Let me add what may be another nail in the coffin of self-esteem, Simon. When and if it is eventually proven correct, are you familiar with Professor Edward Dewey and his foundation for the study of cycles at the University of Pittsburgh? Yes, many years ago, I purchased a large collection of back number copies of his foundation's monthly magazine, Cycles. I have them packed away here somewhere. What of them, Mr. Ogg? Professor Dewey had spent more than 40 years of his life studying cycles, rhythmic fluctuations that repeat with regularity in everything from earthquakes to abundance of grain crops to stock market prices to sunspot eruptions and several hundred other disciplines. I know. Professor Dewey visited me 3 years ago and said that he had been impressed by my writings in Success Unlimited. He asked if I'd be willing to work with him in writing a book about cycles that the layman could understand. I was so honored by his request that I jumped at the chance. I spent more than a year digging through his files and notes and charts, and we finally brought forth a book called Cycles, Mysterious Forces that Trigger Coming Events. Mr. Ogg, the longer I know you, the more you amaze me. Mr. Ogg, oh, that's natural, Simon. Anyway, Professor Dewey believes that there may be another factor affecting our activities and attitudes. He thinks there is a strong possibility that several planetary positions, when they occur, may exert some sort of immeasurable force that affects our actions in groups, so that sometimes they make us fight. Sometimes they make us love. Sometimes they make us write and paint and compose. And all the while, we think we are doing these and other things solely for rational reasons. He says that we may all be puppets on a string and that we must learn what controls that string out there and then cut it. Otherwise, we will never reach our full potential, nor will we ever regain our self-esteem. I like your professor, Mr. Ogg. Now, if you have been raised and educated with these possibilities that you are only a grain of sand with little or no control over your fate, and then you are exposed each day to events that drain all your individuality and are immersed constantly in the negative garbage that spews upon you from newspapers, radios, television, movies, and the theater, and combine all that with concern for your personal security, your life savings, your family's well-being, your own future, and then add to that the fear that the world is becoming a cesspool of pollution or may blow itself up some bright spring day. How can you really maintain any degree of self-esteem when you must spend most of your time and effort merely trying to survive? Why should you think very highly of yourself? How can you be happy? What is there to like in you? So what's great about this life? Who called this heaven on earth? Somehow, old friend, I suspect you're asking me rhetorical questions. Simon frowned and his shoulders slumped in momentary weariness from his long discourse. Then a full smile transfigured his face. His eyes opened wide and he raised his voice. The paradoxical reply, Mr. Ogg, is that despite all the forces arrayed against us, we still want very much to be proud of our lives. We still desire with our heart to reach our full potential. And it is only because a small flame of hope still burns inside all of us that we weep in shame at our failures, at our gradual descent into the common pit of mediocrity. We are like those figures in so many Renaissance paintings portraying souls condemned to hell and sliding down into the molten fire where their hands still reach out, still reach up, still seek help, help that usually never comes. Is there any hope, Simon? Does it really do much good to light one tiny candle in all this darkness? There is always hope. When all hope has gone, the world will end. And do you think of only one candle when you seek to overcome the blackness of despair? If everyone lit a candle, we could turn the darkest night into the brightest day. I tried playing the devil's advocate, but hasn't the human race been scarred and maimed beyond the point of repair? The world is moving too fast for the average person. He steps off the road early in life and forfeits his place to the swift and unscrupulous and the mean. For every so-called success story ran this world, there was 1,000 miserable failures, and that ratio doesn't seem to change for the better as the population increases. Mr. Aga, I'm surprised to hear you talk that way. You seem to be measuring success and failure like everyone else. You cannot mean what you are asking. You could not have written your book believing that success is measured solely by bank balances. I don't, Simon. Yet I can't tell you how many programs I've been on where this kind of question has been asked of me by some interviewer who has not read my book and therefore assumes that I've written another rah rah book telling the reader how to be successful, which is always equated with how to get rich. Let's face it, rich and success are synonymous in this country. I know it is sad but true. Then, when you try to explain while the television camera is staring at you with its little red light shining, that your book has little to do with financial gain and everything to do with peace of mind or happiness, you usually get a sarcastic chuckle and a series of questions fired at you that are damn tough to handle. For instance, Mr. Odd, okay, it's all very well for you to talk about happiness and peace of mind, they say, but how do you bring a smile to the face of a man who is out of work with five hungry mouths to feed and nothing in the refrigerator? How do you calm the mind and soul of a young ghetto mother who has been ground up by her environment while she struggles to support her three fatherless children? How do you convince a dying person that he can still enjoy what's remaining of his life? What do you tell a housewife who is certain that she's doomed to a life of dirty dishes and unmade beds? None of those problems you pose are easy, Mr. Ogg. And yet, let me remind you once again that each of these individuals and everyone else in the world still have their own pilot light burning inside them. It may be very diminished in some, but this, I tell you, it never goes out. So long as there is a breath of life remaining, there is still hope. And that's what we rag pickers count on. Just give us a chance and we can provide the fuel that will be ignited by any pilot light, no matter how diminished it may be. A human being, my friend, is an amazing and complex and resilient organism capable of resuscitating itself from its own living death many times if it is given the opportunity and shown the way. And that's where you rag pickers operate among the living dead, the losers of humanity. Usually, I have discovered that most individuals are neither willing nor ready to accept help until they have hit bottom. At that point, they figure that they have nothing to lose. And so they are far more receptive to my simple technique to help them try to begin a new life, to perform the greatest miracle in the world, to resurrect themselves from their living death. Do you read Emerson, Mr. Ogg? I haven't read Emerson since my senior year in high school. What a shame. Emerson should be read by 30 and 40 and 50-year olds, not teenagers. Emerson wrote, "Our strength grows out of our weakness. The indignation which arms itself with secret forces does not awaken until we are pricked and stung and sorely assailed. When man is pushed, tormented, defeated, he has a chance to learn something. He has been put on his wits, on his manhood. He has gained facts, learned his ignorance, and cured of the insanity of conceit. Has got moderation and real skill. But isn't your ultimate goal an impossible dream? Aren't you like Don Quixote, trying to escape from the reality of this life? And aren't you concerned that you are doomed to the same fate? The old values, the old principles just don't work today. What have you what you must do in order for them to be meaningful again is change the entire environment. Simon, you're talking about changing the world. That's been tried again and again. We've got a who's who of martyrs who have tried and failed. They have not failed. While mighty Rome collapsed around him, a wise man named Paulinus continued to care for one small shrine in order to maintain his sanity and equanimity. You can still find his words of wisdom in any library. This old and wise rag picker. Martyrs do not fail when their hearts cease to pump. If they did, you and I would not be sitting here discussing the possibility of carrying on their common goal of making this world a better place for all of God's creatures. The old man returned to his seat, reached across, and placed a hand on my knee. Mr. Ogg, why not try to change the world? Why not teach others that they can perform a miracle with their lives? Of what importance is it to man that he does not live in the center of the universe, so long as he can create his own beautiful world? Why should man care that he has descended from the animal kingdom once he realizes that he has powers possessed by no other animal? And why should it concern him that some of his actions are triggered by youthful impressions, buried in his subconscious mind, when he still has the power to control his mind and thus ordain his ultimate destiny? Only man, each in his own way, has the ultimate decision on how his life is lived. He has said so much that was deep and meaningful that I had to call a halt to our discussion, or at least lighten the mood in order to have time to digest his remarks. So I lit a cigarette and tried to bait him. Simon, the astrologers wouldn't think much of your remarks about man having the ability to control his own destiny. He nodded his head sadly and smiled. Seers, astrologers, medicine man, palmists, numerologists, psychics, each age has many security blankets. The old man tousled my gray hair. You know Shakespeare, Mr. Ogg? A little. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Okay, that is the end of chapter 5. Thank you so much for listening.